Hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest Trivium China Flash Talk for another of our biweekly or fortnightly updates on the Chinese economy. My name is Andrew Polk. I'm head of our, previously head of our markets research, but I'm a co-founder of Trivium China, and I'm here with our new head of markets research, Denny McMahon. Denny, welcome as always to the Flash Talk.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here as always.
Today we are going to look at kind of the state of consumption, as we've said in the past couple of webinars. Consumption is really the big variable for the economic trajectory this year. We've got some latest developments on that front, both in terms of policy and in terms of officials from the PBOC weighing in. So Denny's going to walk us through that, and then we will talk about the disappearance of Baofeng at Renaissance that's been in the news, and the latest efforts to by regulators to crack down on corruption in the financial sector. And then we'll finish up with a little preview of the shakeup of the financial regulators that will happen next week at the two sessions, which starts on March 5th. And so we have a full slate today. I am mostly here to act as MC. I was on holiday last week, as I mentioned in our last Flash Talk, got a little sunburnt on my face. So I was not paying attention to China's economy. I left that to Denny. So I'm mostly going to act as MC and kind of asked any questions about what he's seen over the past couple of weeks, because he's been in the thick of it. As always, please feel free to share these with colleagues and other folks outside of your organization that you think would be interested in Trivium research. We always appreciate recommendations for new clients, so please do spread the word. With that, we'll jump in. Denny, what's the latest on the consumer trajectory, and what's the latest on kind of policymaker thinking around what consumption might look like this year?
Well, I think the most interesting development we've had since the last time we've done one of these is that the central bank, the PBOC, actually weighed in on this. So last week, they published their monetary policy report for the fourth quarter, and it had a dedicated section on consumption. And their comments were quite interesting. First, they were like, okay, clearly consumption has been weak over the last few years. Said, during the 3 years of the pandemic, consumption, purchases on consumption goods rose on average 3.6%, where in the previous 3 years, 2017, 2019, the annual average was 6.9%. Okay. Now, the PBOC's take is that now that all the restrictions of zero COVID are gone and that economic certainty is starting to creep back in, that consumption is going to rebound this year. And I mean, we're seeing signs of this already. However, I think perhaps the most interesting comments that they had were like, even though leisure spending and entertainment and dining, all that sort of stuff is coming back, and people are going to start spending some of their excess savings, it remains to be seen to what extent people do actually spend down their excess savings. The way that they explained it is that, look, over the last 3 years, income growth has really slowed. And they used an expression or a variation on an expression that Chinese economists have been using a lot recently, which is that household balance sheets have been damaged. And although the PBOC's take was like, well, income has slowed, for a lot of people, income really took a hit over the last few years, because, so much of income in China isn't just your monthly wage. It is the 13th month bonus. It is all the incremental perks, subsidies from your state employer for air conditioning, and, cards that you can use at a shopping center or a grocery store. And those are the things that go first when times are tough. Now, we saw something like this about 5 years ago, when there was a lot of a crackdown on trying to get government agencies to sort of tighten up their budgets. It was ordinary people who got hit hardest because of all these sort of, these perks that aren't part of their official compensation. They were the easiest just to eliminate. And so certainly a lot of people last year didn't get a 13-month bonus anywhere near on the scale that they're used to. Now, and so this is again one of the issues, like, when it comes to these excess savings, sure, savings accelerated massively last year, but whose are they? To what extent are these savings concentrated in the hands of high income earners who are probably less likely to spend them down anyway? And of course, also there's the issue for even people who didn't necessarily see their income take a hit last year, even if they saw a decline in their pace of their income expansion, that wasn't necessarily great for their balance sheets either, because certainly in China's biggest cities, certainly in any city which has seen aggressive property price acceleration over the last decade, one of the things that has made high property prices sustainable, or has allowed people to be able to take out mortgages and buy homes at high property prices, is the knowledge that their income is going to expand rapidly over the next few years. Because what today might be a barely manageable mortgage becomes really quite manageable in a few years' time when you're getting an income boost of between 8 to 12% every year. And if that slowed over the last few years, then again, that sort of has made life difficult for people who expected to be in a better financial position by now, even though their income continued to expand. So this is one of the arguments, that over the last few years that households just aren't better off for all sorts of reasons. And the PBOC also made another argument, and that was like, look, sure, we're now out of zero COVID, but people are clearly still mindful of what the future evolution of COVID might look like. So because so many people got COVID when zero COVID was lifted, in January and December, in some ways it felt like almost the entire country got COVID in a two-month period. And in some ways that was great because it massively reduced the potential for a second wave. But the PBOC is saying that people are still aware that there could be a second wave, that there could be, that COVID is still out there, and it might change in ways that we can't anticipate, and that is affecting people's willingness to consume. So really interesting reflections on kind of the consumption outlook. In some ways, this kind of gels with the way we've been looking at things, because we think consumption is definitely going to rebound this year. I think, if we expect China this year to post fairly robust economic growth, and it will be consumption that's driving that thing. However, Chinese authorities kind of have to lead the public through an initial period to a point where they're comfortable consuming again. And we think this is one of the reasons why they've front-loaded the quota for the issuance of special purpose bonds this year, to kind of really get the economy kind of churning, ramping up quickly, so that people's expectations about the future start to take a turn for the better. And we also think that we're going to see a lot more consumption support mechanisms. Now, when you see a policy agency like this saying, hey, consumption's really important, but we don't necessarily think it's going to be great as we thought it would be, that's not a single signal that regulators are going to sit on their hands. I mean, you take this together with what Xi Jinping, to the extent to which Xi Jinping prioritized consumption in his Central Economic Work Conference speech. I mean, that says as much as anything that the authorities aren't going to sit back and just wait to see what happens. I mean, it is a clear, to me at least, it is a clear signal that there will be policy mechanisms to try and drive consumption. Now, at the moment, all of that seems to be at a local level. We've seen a new sort of spate of vouchers being rolled out by large cities around the country. I mean, the typical model at the moment seems to be, you can get a voucher which effectively, which you can use in the purchase of mainly home appliances, white goods, electrical goods. In some cases, it's dining out, and effectively it gives you a discount on the sticker price of whatever it is you're purchasing of about 10%. So this is the idea of the government effectively providing a 10% discount to the public to kind of get them out spending. the scale of these things seem, fairly small, but they might ramp up over the year. So, for example, I think Beijing has said that it's going to effectively have this rolling voucher project for the rest of the year. It will be pushing out vouchers to coincide with big holidays and other kind of significant spending events on the calendar. Nanjing, I think, is doing something similar, kind of, it's not a one-off. They're going to keep doing a number of rounds of these throughout the years. So we're certainly seeing movement in that direction. I'm still keeping my eyes out for something that's more central led, even if it's not explicit policy, but then at least better guidance as to what local level consumption policy should look like. And I'm assuming we'll see something more along those lines in March. So that's where we stand with consumption at the moment. It's like, clearly it is coming back. People are spending more, but this big question of how much more are they going to spend? To what extent are they going to spend their savings to really supercharge growth this year? It's going to take a real effort in changing people's psychology. The regulators are aware of that, and I think we're going to see measures designed to try and make it happen.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a couple of observations from my side there. One is, as we talked about in our last flash talk, you reiterated that most of the consumption support measures to date, I mean, virtually all of them in this cycle have been local. March 5th, next week, is the start of the National People's Congress, where we get some of the, annual policy updates and kind of policy framework, particularly on economic policy. So we will be looking out next week to see if there is a more centralized kind of push, whether that's actual central policymakers, enacting moves or giving more of a framework to localities on what they should be doing. It remains to be seen. But I mean, I'm with you. I'd be pretty shocked if consumption didn't feature pretty heavily in the work report, given Xi Jinping's focus on it. Obviously, the PBOC and others are focused on it as well. One other observation I just think, may be worth throwing out there is, I think something that the PBOC is hitting on here when it comes to the kind of consumption paradox that they're highlighting is kind of short-term dynamics versus structural issues. I think, as you said, it sounds like the PBOC's view is kind of in line with ours, which is in the short term, i.e. 2023, this year, don't overthink it. Consumers are going to come back. There's no way to have a worse year than you had last year. So people are going to come out, they're going to spend again. Base effects alone mean you'll have pretty solid growth in consumer spending. But then the question is, what extra do you get? Is there revenge spending? Is there, people with the border restrictions coming down going to be, traveling outside of the country more, traveling even within the country more? And it strikes me that short-term picture, I think, in my view, the way I'd put it, rather than the way the PBOC put it, but it's almost natural. It's almost inevitable. We're going to get a pretty solid pop from consumption. So I think some of the debate around is it going to be 8%, 9% is a little bit semantics. It's just going to be a solid economic story for China and Chinese assets based on this consumer revival. That's my perspective. But the other issues that you're highlighting are these really structural issues. I mean, COVID definitely had an impact on slowing wage growth, but that's a dynamic that's been in play for a decade, right? Wage growth has been slowly declining, and that's part of China's maturing of its economy. It's overall going to be growing slower and slower and slower as the economy shifts more towards services, as the catch-up gains that it's seen for years and years and years dissipate more and more. So I think the way to think about it to me is a lot of the things that we think might depress or hold back consumption are structural issues that will really kind of reassert themselves, in my view, kind of over the medium term after we get the pop from in 2023 from consumption. Then maybe consumers start to think again about their sort of structural balance sheets. That's how I'd view it. I guess the other thing to think about is you were talking about rising incomes help to boost or allow people to to not worry that that housing is getting more and more expensive, so they can, know they're going to have more income in the future. That's also sort of a self-reinforcing cycle, right? Because if like your income is going to grow, then you can afford to buy the bigger house, and or the more expensive house. And you also know that your house price is going to continue to go up. So you also have a wealth effect. So not only is your income growing, but your wealth is growing, and it's all a virtuous cycle. Now, with income growth slowing and property prices stagnating, if not declining, you not only have the weaker income effect, but you also have a negative wealth effect right now, and potentially on an ongoing basis, in terms of the restructuring of the property sector. So that's just another medium-term kind of negative impact on, as you put it, household balance sheets. So certainly not out of the woods, I guess is probably the wrong way to say it. We're not betting on a sustained multi-year consumer revival, because these structural issues will challenge that capability of the economy to more structurally adjust towards consumption. But that doesn't, in my view, change the shorter term trajectory, which is, people are just going to get out and spend because they're sick of being locked down for 3 years. So just a couple observations from my side, in terms of how we kind of parse out the short term versus the medium term dynamics on the consumer side. Anything else on that point before we pivot on to the financial sector, Denny?
No, absolutely. So you want to move to
yeah, let's move on. Can you give us a quick recap on, so we'll look at the financial sector in terms of the corruption crackdown more generally, but kind of over the past couple of weeks, give us the details on, Balfon, who he is, what the story's been. So for people who haven't been watching it as closely, they know why this is important.
Okay, so last week, Balfon, who was the founder of a investment bank called Renaissance, disappeared. And after a few days, I think it was the beginning of this week, Renaissance finally issued a statement saying, yes, that he has been detained and he's cooperating with authorities. Now, Balfon has a sort of a very well-founded reputation as a rainmaker when it comes to doing tech sector deals. I mean, this guy has a huge profile, and in large part, I mean, Renaissance's reputation is built upon Balfon himself. So the question then became, why is he being detained, and what's going on? Now, the Wall Street Journal had a story today with more details about why he has been detained. They're saying that it is related to an ongoing investigation into an employee of Renaissance. I think it was the chairman of their overseas branch or whatever. But anyway, it was a former ICB executive who came over to Renaissance when he left ICBC. And the investigation into him is not into his time at Renaissance, but into his operations prior to leaving ICBC. Now, of course, there is an inclination with these sorts of things to kind of go, well, we've got a new anti-corruption czar, Li Xi, who, just ascended to the Politburo Standing Committee. He took that role in October. All of a sudden, we've had the nabbing of one of the most high-profile private sector executives that we've seen since, I think, probably about 2017 or 2018. Does this represent a shift in the approach of the CCDI, which is the anti-corruption body? Is this a sign of things to come? Now, of course, the problem with these sorts of things is the timing, because, again, according to the Wall Street Journal's reporting, the investigation into this former ICB official started in September, which was before Li Xi ascended to the CCDI. So it's a question of, is this about a very specific instance? Is this part of an ongoing investigation into the financial sector that's been going on for the last couple of years now? Or does this signal something new, a shift in approach because we've got a new guy at the top? On first inspection, this seems to be a continuation. It's about a specific case, and it doesn't seem to be associated with new personalities in charge of the anti-corruption movement. Now that said, the CCDI, Li Shi, the CCDI published a speech by Li Shi. It was their work report in January. Now the report only came out last week, and although we can't necessarily attach what's happening with Bao Fund to the new leadership, the speech was really quite interesting because it signaled a potential change in focus of what the CCDI is going to be looking at and going after in the near future. And specifically, what they're talking about is taking a much closer look at finance and a much closer look at SOEs. Now, specifically, the sort of things they were talking about were, and this was the one that really got our attention, is that they want to prevent political and business collusion from damaging the political and the development environment, which is something that kind of screams the involvement of finance and the financial sector as well. They were also talking about particularly taking on corruption where political and economic issues intertwine. They're talking about preventing leading cadres from becoming spokesmen for special interest groups. Now, we've seen this before back in the day. Effectively the chairman of the insurance regulator was, for all intents and purposes, a lobbyist for the insurance sector. It does happen from time to time where regulators get captured. Now, no specific instances jump to mind at the moment, but that's the sort of thing that they're looking to crack down on. They're also talking about dealing with issues arriving from the revolving door of people moving between business and government. And they also want to focus on preventing family members of leading officials from using their influence to extract perks and benefits from the business sector. So this work report by the new corruption czar is very focused on the business sector. Now, within that bubble, they're going to be looking very specifically at SOEs and also finance. Now, as I said, I'm not sure whether what's happening with Balfan at the moment can be kind of linked into this new framework, but it's certainly something to keep in mind over the next year or two in terms of how we should perhaps be looking where anti-corruption measures move to next, because they have this very clear vision as to the time has come to kind of weed out this kind of the political sort of the corruption at the point that business and politics combine. So something to look for, to look forward to. But it's certainly, it was a very interesting speech. And of course, with these things, it's difficult to know just how aggressively they'll pursue this agenda, whether it will be pursued at all, or whether other events will take over, or to what extent it'll get rolling. But something to keep on the radar.
Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me, the CCDI has been looking into the financial sector really at Xi Jinping's behest for about a year now, right? There's
Absolutely.
a very, couple dozen, I think, financial institutions were specifically singled out for sort of being looked into, and we've seen a few heads roll. Obviously, was it Sun Guofeng, the PBOC official,
Absolutely.
kind of the highest level official to be taken down. So in a system that rules by kind of campaigns, like policy campaigns, anti-corruption campaigns, this may be sort of an extension or almost a deepening of that past year's campaign, right? We started at a certain place. We were focused on the financial sector. Now we're focused on sort of business and politics more generally, but certainly that's going to continue to involve the financial sector because it is so, integral to not only, financing, deal making, but obviously to the way the financial system works, or excuse me, the way the economy works more generally. It is interesting. This is maybe a good way to pivot to the next topic is, I think a lot of people are wondering, since 2017, we've had this pretty widespread crackdown on financial risk, right? And one element of that was corruption, looking into corruption at financial institutions with varying intensities at various times. So it is interesting with the current outgoing or the current financial policymakers going out the door that maybe they are refocusing on kind of a systemic level on on corruption in the financial sector and where politics and business interact. Do you think this? I guess the question would be: do you think that will indicate some level of continuity in terms of how regulators have been, pretty aggressive towards the financial sector over the past 4-5 years? Or is this a kind of an effort to kind of institutionalize what seemed to have been a very personality driven regulatory approach over the past 5-6 years? Or do you think that this isn't as linked to a more systemic approach to how they're regulated in the financial sector?
My instinct is that it's not linked, largely because, to the best of my understanding of the system, the CCDI does not work hand in glove with the banking regulator and the central bank. So to the extent that we've seen, and we've seen an incredible amount of financial sector reform over the last 5 years, the extent to which risk in the financial sector has been reined in over the last 5 years is far beyond anything that I could have anticipated 5 years ago. It's been, quite incredible. But that has all been driven specifically under the banking regulator and also the central bank. The CCDI's role is very different. It kind of comes in above everybody and, kicks ass and takes names. It's not necessarily, and we saw this last year when it did a review of the regulators and the big banks. It was quite quite scathing in some ways, that it didn't think that they'd necessarily done a good enough job in dealing with certain issues. So it's not that they necessarily cooperate together. It's the CCDI kind of comes in as a dark shadow and kind of, tries to clean up any messes that it perceives as being a mess. So if we're talking about the financial sector reforms over the last 5 years, how it transitions in the next 5 years, well, the first thing is probably less reform is actually needed, because under Guo Xiuqing, the banking regulator has done an incredible job. Now, I think whoever comes in next is not going to be Guo Xiuqing. It's not somebody who will have the reputation or the inclination, might not even have the authority to be able to smack heads the way that he was able to. I mean, Guo was recalled from governor of Shandong. He wasn't only put in charge of the banking regulator, but he was made party secretary of the PBOC. It was that second hat which kind of made it very clear at the time that Guo was being brought in for a very specific reason, given his reputation, and that was to clean up the sector, and he didn't disappoint. It doesn't look like anybody kind of has that sort of reputation coming in to these new faces coming into the regulatory roles. Now, what I think is happening at the moment is Guo is trying to bind the hands of whoever is his successor, because we've seen some quite interesting new regulations drop just in the last few weeks. One has been new rules that determine bank disclosures of risk. So demanding of China's biggest banks far more information being disclosed publicly about on various risk metrics. And the second one was new rules which really, it looks like it's going to significantly increase banks' disclosures of non-performing loans. Now, the interesting thing about this regulation is that it was circulated for comment in the banking sector in 2019. The CBIRC voted internally to roll it out in March 2020. Of course, the problem with March 2020 is that China's economy was dealing with some bigger issues, and the whole idea of imposing an additional burden on the financial sector of recognizing more NPLs at the onset of a pandemic, they thought better of it, and it was put in on the back shelf. Now, of course, now that zero COVID has moved on, it makes sense to roll out these rules that have been waiting for literally years. But it is also quite interesting that literally 2 to 3 weeks before Guo Xiuqing is set to step down, all of a sudden these rules, which will, if followed, will have a very significant impact at the pace at which China's banks clean up their balance sheets. They're being dropped now just as Guo's going out the door. So to me, this looks like an attempt of Guo, kind of like, whoever's coming in next, you have to deal with this stuff. The particularly interesting stuff about that regulations is it's a 2-year phase-in period. And so whoever's coming next is going to be dealing with this. This is going to be one of their first points of new regulation that they have to deal with. So I think that's quite interesting at the moment, that the regulatory agenda, I cannot imagine it being the anti-risk agenda being pursued with the same degree of intensity as we've seen over the last 5 years. Guo Shuqing knows it, and he's trying to put in some railguards to ensure that at least progress is continued to be made.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so we're obviously looking at a reshuffle of the heads of all of the financial regulators. So the PBOC, Egong is going to step down as, or very likely going to step down as governor of the PBOC. Guo Shuqing, who heads up the banking regulator, the CBIRC, and as you said, is the party secretary of the PBOC, will be stepping down. Yue Man, who runs the CSRC, is likely to move into a new job. So we're looking at fresh blood at the top of all of these regulators, which is important, but also we're looking at just a wider restructuring potentially of how sort of the financial policy making apparatus works. And Xi Jinping basically said that after when he was in a speech discussing the second plenum, which the communique of which came out just yesterday. I know that's all a little esoteric, but the second plenum of the 20th Party Congress effectively happened over the past few days. Part of that was to approve the restructuring of the government that's going to be announced during the two sessions, and then, like I said, starts next week. So question for you, Denny, is, what are I know there are some reporting and rumors flying around some of the changes that might be made. But beyond just the changes of the seats, the people in the seats, what should we be looking for in terms of this broader potential restructuring on how financial policy is made more generally?
Well, the most interesting potential reform is that they will introduce the a new regulatory body that sits above the financial regulators, the central bank, the banking regulator, the insurance, the securities regulator, called the Central Financial Work Commission. Now, this is an old institution that was put in place following the Asian financial crisis between 1998 and 2003. And in some ways, this very, very much looks like the Financial Stability and Development Committee that was introduced a few years ago, which was imposed exactly to do that same sort of role as kind of an overarching regulator that could coordinate the various financial regulators. Now, the question is, why replace one with kind of a duplicate? Now, the new institution, firstly, would be a party institution. It would be headed by an existing member of the Politburo Standing Committee. The existing the FSDC, Financial Stability and Development Committee, is a state council, so a government institution. It's kind of headed by Liu He and kind of run on a daily basis by Yi Gang at the PBOC. Now, the sense is that the current body, the FSDC, perhaps hasn't been as effective as could have been hoped. And that is because potentially, I mean, this is all kind of secondhand, that Liu He and Yi Gang are both kind of career academics. They're not bureaucratic infighters. They're not kind of creatures of the system, and that in terms of providing that guidance for the sector, they weren't necessarily it wasn't the most necessarily effective institution. Now, by bringing in a new organization, well, it brings in a new slate. It's kind of a fresh state, a new approach to dealing with the same problem. And by giving it party authority, then potentially it gives it a greater gravitas and sort of greater ability to kind of smack heads, so to speak. So, of course, this is all part of a broader restructuring of the government, which happens every 5 years. But this is sort of the one that we're kind of looking at to see if it gets implemented. And of course, even if it does, it's going to take some time to actually see how it works in practice and whether there are any real effective changes from having one of these oversight committees as opposed to another one. So that's what we're looking for. But at the moment, the jury is very much still out as to whether this will result in kind of meaningful changes.
So just to reiterate there, so there's a lot of acronyms flying around. The Central Financial Work Commission, which was expected to be reinstituted. As Danny was saying, it will be a new institution, but it's actually an old institution that's being reintroduced. And so, that's interesting in and of itself, partly because why was it introduced previously? But to deal with the fallout from the Asian financial crisis. So like big, a big deal in a body that had a very specific purpose during a period of time, and now is being brought back, presumably because top policymakers see challenges ahead and want to raise kind of the level of decision making around financial policymaking matters. That will be replacing, as Denise said, the FSDC, and so which is the Financial Stability and Development Committee. We've been hearing that the FSDC, which was run by Liu He, had really become, while it was started to be a coordinating body, as Denise said, had really just become kind of an announcement mechanism, a way to go out and kind of tame the markets. And when there was, volatility, particularly in the equity markets. And I think one of the reasons that this is so important is when you look at something, for example, like the tech crackdown that has happened over the past few years. It was hugely uncoordinated, and a body like the FSDC was trying to get other bodies to coordinate better. The problem was a lot of the institutions that were moving forward with tech regulation were not government bodies. They were party bodies, like the Cybersecurity Administration. And they were like, well, we don't answer to you, FSDC. You don't have the authority. So by instituting the Financial Work Commission, reinstituting the Financial Work Commission, Central Financial Work Commission, you potentially solve that issue by saying, okay, we're a party body that's working on financial issues, and we can go grab the CAC, the Cybersecurity Administration, because we have a different kind of authority within the party system. And it could lead to not only more coordinated financial policymaking, but more coordinated policymaking between financial policymakers and other policymakers, namely people in the tech space, people in the innovation space, people in the manufacturing, so like MIT, industry and manufacturing type regulators. So that's something that may be interesting as well. Because we've been internally wrestling with why do this? What is the need that they think they're addressing by potentially reintroducing this body? And that coordination mechanism, to me, seems like the most obvious point. That then you have a body with more authority, more capability to reach out to other party institutions and potentially have a more kind of rationalized policymaking space where we've seen a lot of policy whiplash over the past 2 or 3 years. So we'll keep our eye out there. The other piece is, I don't know, Denny, if you have thoughts, who's going to run this thing? Who's going to, because you need kind of a heavyweight to run it. Do we have any thoughts on who might be kind of at the top seat on a group like the Financial Work Commission?
I think the money at the moment is on Li Qiang, who is likely to be the incoming premier. And if it's not him, it might be Ding Xuexiang, who is dibbed to be the executive vice premier. So that's those are the two names that are likely to be in charge. Andrew, do you have any thoughts on either of those guys? Or
No, well, I think that comes back to something that we've been pointing out a lot ever since the reshuffling of the party at the plenum or at the party congress in November last year. Is both of those guys, neither Li Qiang nor Ding Xuexiang, have any central government policymaking experience. They are, political heavyweights. They're close to Xi Jinping, which is where they kind of get their authority. But you're talking about, if the goal of this new body, like we're surmising, is to improve coordination among the breadth of policymakers that financial officials need to coordinate with, you need somebody who knows what they're doing. And it's a big question on the system right now is these guys, everything we hear about them is that they're very capable, smart people, but they just don't have the resume. They haven't been in places of central authority, whether in the party system or the government. They've run large provinces, right? Like, for example, in the case of Li Chang, but they just, when you're talking about running these policymaking apparatuses from a central level, it's just orders of magnitude more complex. And so not only do we have questions about, who will be at the top of the table, but if the front runners for those seats are right, Li Chang and Ding Xuexiang, then it's still an open question of how good they're going to do the job, not because we don't think, that they're capable, but because they just haven't built up a track record on this front. So a lot of uncertainties in that space. Hopefully, we'll be getting answers over the next 2 weeks to at least, which butts are in which seats and how the reorganization of the government and the party looks. And then we'll be able to analyze a little bit more, I think, what we think the ultimate impacts are. But for now, lots of question marks. And even once we do have the answers to where the pieces all fit, there will be really some question marks left around how smoothly the new organizational structure can execute policy. So those are the things we'll be thinking about, in the weeks and months ahead, at a time of, very great economic uncertainty. Having fresh blood in with a pretty thin resume at the central level is somewhat concerning. But I guess we'll see how it goes. I don't know, Denny, if you have any final thoughts on that front in terms of what the musical chairs looks like and what the resumes of these key economic and financial policymakers may mean. But we don't want to make too many predictions, but we'll certainly be tracking it over the next few months as we kind of start to get a sense of how capable these people are in their new positions.
No, Andrew, I think you just summed it up. At this point, the best we can do is wait and see. We know who they are. We know that they're sort of limited experience. Now we just have to see how this thing works.
Yeah. Well, with that, it's not exactly a dour note, but certainly an uncertain one. All we can say is that we'll definitely be here with you with our clients and our subscribers to think things through as events unfold. And, we'll be doing that not only through our writing, but obviously in these biweekly updates as well. So Denny, as always, thanks a bunch for joining me today. Very informative. Appreciate you keeping the ship stable while I was away on holiday and keeping everybody updated on the latest. So thanks for the time, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good, Andrew.
Bye, everybody.